Okay, welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the State Section Director for MUFON LA. We have a fabulous speaker. It's been a long, long time since Don Ecker has been here, probably about 12, 15 years, and I'm happy to introduce him tonight. Don Ecker first became interested in the UFO phenomenon in 1966 when he, along with several other witnesses, saw a UFO up close and personal. Don says it was, quote, unlike anything I had ever seen before. I realized right then and there that there was much more to this UFO thing than the authorities were letting on. Let me give you a little background on Don. He's a former law enforcement officer and a criminal investigator with over 10 years of law enforcement experience. In 1986, while a member of SWAT, he suffered a wound in action, and that led to an early retirement of Don's law enforcement career. But while recuperating, he went back to the old mystery he was so captivated by when he was a youth and began to research and write on the UFO mystery. Don has presented papers at international MUFON conferences, has appeared on numerous times on Larry King, Live, Hard Copy, A Current Affair, and many other programs related to ufology. He and his wife, Vicki, also owned and ran UFO magazine for many years. But let's talk about why Don's here tonight. Since Don was a young boy, he's had an inexplicable fascination with the moon. Don grew up during the Apollo program, and it was a heady time to be in the aeronautics industry. On July 20th, 1969, American astronauts touched down on the moon, and at that moment, the sky seemed to be the limit on what we could achieve if we put our minds to it. Remember, only 66 years prior to that were the first tentative steps taken by the Wright brothers to get into the air. And that first flimsy airplane quickly morphed into a spacecraft touching down on another world. How could anyone doubt just what we might be capable of? And yet suddenly, after only a half a dozen missions to the moon, the plug was inexplicably pulled. Today, it's unbelievable, but nevertheless, at the time, NASA claimed that they ended the ambitious program that they spent billions of dollars on because the American people had lost interest in lunar exploration after only 6 events. What really happened? Since the manned lunar program had ceased, rumors swirled in some circles that we had been told by certain entities to get off the moon, vacate, leave. In a 1976 book, science writer George Leonard wrote a book called Somebody Else is on the Moon. Leonard's book showed NASA photographs which seemed to show artificial structures on the surface of the moon that were not ours, some truly gigantic. That book seemed to disappear almost as soon as it was made available, but rumors persisted that another presence inhabited the moon. So what about this notion of artificial structures on the moon? Were we in fact told to back off? Tonight, Don's going to see if he can answer those questions for us and many more. Please put your hands together tonight and give a warm welcome to Mr. Don Ecker.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And as Steve said, it has been quite a while since my last appearance here. The moon is something that we all take for granted. It's something that has been there from the day we were born. We probably have shared a few kisses, maybe something else under the moon, on a warm summer night. And it's something that, quite frankly, we take for granted. But what really is it up there? In order to really start this presentation, I've got to go back into the past a little bit to kind of give you some context of what brought me to this point that I'm at here tonight. In 1986, as Steve had mentioned, I was wounded in the line of duty, and ultimately I medically retired. During that retirement process, I was going through physical rehabilitation, and had at that point just gone through a divorce. My wife and I had lost a child to an illness, and as often happens in times like that, the marriage ultimately fell apart. So to say that I was at wit's end and at loose ends would be actually a little, was that a little too close? Okay. To say that I was at loose ends would probably be an understatement. But to aid myself in that physical rehab process, I had been captivated by a new device that was just coming into the forefront called the personal computer. And although I had been around computers in law enforcement and other things, I had never personally had my hands on one. I ended up buying one. Then I compounded that error by getting a telephone modem for it. Now, for any of you more recent people, a telephone modem enabled you to go online. It actually went through your telephone system, and you could go primarily to BBSs, but there were then also some pay-as-you-go things like CompuServe. And I had a roaring 300 baud modem, and yeah, and ended up discovering CompuServe at $6.40 an hour at 300 baud. When I was on there, I stumbled over something called the Issues Forum. And in there were some files that were rather unusual that dealt with, among other things, UFOs, UFO sightings, and cattle mutilations. Now, in 1981-82, I had investigated as a lead investigator 2 cattle mutilations. Incidentally, that case was never solved. Make a long story short, my department swept it under the rug, and I was curious about it. So suddenly, I began to get an inkling of why they may have swept that under the rug. But because I really wasn't doing a heck of a lot at the time, I was taking some college courses, although at that point, I decided to do a little armchair investigation. I was intrigued by the whole UFO thing. So I started. I did an intensive 6-month study for my own purposes to find out exactly what I was getting into. And to make a long story short, I was totally captivated. Then I discovered my wife, well at the time not my wife, but I discovered UFO Magazine that had recently started to be published in 1986. Well, it seemed to be a match made in heaven. So, I ended up moving down here to California, and I was working full-time on this enigma. And at the time, I thought, rather naively, and perhaps a little arrogantly, that with my investigative background, with just the right case, with just the right investigation, that we could make the mainstream scientific establishment and perhaps media sit up and take notice. Oh boy, did I have a surprise coming there. But I proceeded on. Now, in 1991, I was a guest on a radio show out of Glendale with a legendary, longtime television radio personality by the name of Jim Hawthorne. Now, Jim and I hit it off, and he invited me to come in and co-host with him, which was basically the start of my radio broadcasting. Now, Jim had come out of retirement for this gig, and after roughly 6 months, he was tired of driving up from San Diego. Okay, so what did that mean? He said, well, I'm going to pull the plug, and this time I'm just going home and I'm going to enjoy my retirement, which kind of left me high and dry because suddenly we had developed one heck of an audience in Los Angeles with this weekly UFO show. But it turned out that one of the guys down at KVEG was also a fellow that was an executive with the CRN network, cable radio network, that also was out of Southern California here. They called me up and they invited me down and we talked and they said, well, you know, you could do your radio show out of CRN. So I began. For 6 years that program ran, and we developed a nationwide audience. Now, at the very beginning, I had one week a guy come into the studio, and we did a show on the moon. Now, he discussed the George Leonard book, Somebody Else is on the Moon. I was not aware of it, or if I had been, it had kind of passed over me. But about 4 or 5 days later at UFO Magazine, I got a telephone call from a guy by the name of Jim Sylvan. And Jim had been a lunar researcher for years, and it was actually the Leonard work that got him interested in this to begin with. So, that began it. Now, what are we talking about with the moon? In order to discuss that, we've got to go to, let's hope this works, the very beginning of the 20th century. 1900, 1901, 1902, and 1903. Man's first flight was something other than air. Now, what was the United States like then? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you can imagine it was like another planet. Electricity was only available in a very few places in the largest cities. The horseless carriage was just beginning to make its appearance on our mostly unpaved dirt roads. And when they were out there in the horseless carriage, they had to weave around the horse manure, because most everybody, in fact, still were using horses. But two brothers down in North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright, had another idea. They believed that man had the potential that he could actually fly. Well, by God, they proved it. Now, this is something most of you people interested in the UFO field will also find of interest. They were flying that aircraft and subsequent aircraft for about 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And there were still newspapers around the country that refused to print the story, quite frankly, because they didn't believe it. Does that sound familiar? But from 1903 to 1914, a period of just a little bit over a decade, suddenly the world is at war. And this flimsy aircraft suddenly took on a military air. They, of course, were quite improved from the original Wright brothers airplane, but they still could only fly a little bit over 100 miles an hour. 1914, 15, 16, 17. And they fell out of the sky pretty easy. But in the 1930s, witness one of the first jet aircraft in the world, the British Gloster E-28. We had literally gone from riding horses to the first jet aircraft in just a little over 30 years. Then the Germans came out one better, the Me-262. Now this was an aircraft that could fly a little over 500 miles an hour, armed with cannon and some other goodies, and if Adolf Hitler had gotten out of the way of his Luftwaffe, and it's a good thing he didn't, but had he, there's an excellent possibility we'd all be speaking German today, because this, among some of the other weapons that the Germans developed, quite impressive. But after the war, we got into the jet business in a big way. The Bell X-1, General Chuck Yeager, flew this thing faster than the speed of sound. Which, you know, kind of brings up a couple of other things quickly. How many times have we heard people that have been interested in the UFO topic that the distances between the stars are just simply too vast? There's no way that anybody or anyone could figure out a technology to fly between the stars. Now, this is kind of arrogant for a human population, a civilization that our species has only been around for perhaps, what, 200,000 years, give or take? When you consider that the universe right now is guesstimated to be somewhere around 15 billion years old, give or take a billion. We've been around as Homo sapiens sapiens for roughly 200,000 years. Who's to say what someone else out there with another 10,000, 100,000, or a million years in front of us might have accomplished? But why do I mention this? The Bell X-1 flew faster than the speed of sound. At the time, there were scientists, mainstream scientists, that were screaming that it was impossible because they would hit a sound wall and the aircraft would disintegrate. Well, obviously that didn't happen. But there it is. So we went from 1903 to 1947, boom. We bust the sound barrier. Then, a few years later, our German scientists that we brought back from World War II were working on our rocket programs. The Russians, German scientists that they had brought back from World War II were working on Russian programs. And they thumped us. They got there first, Sputnik. I was a little boy, about 6 or 7 years old, and I remember hearing the radio broadcast. This thing was flying around out there, beep, beep, beeping. How many in here were around with Sputnik? Are you aware that something was following Sputnik when it went up? Verified by Russian scientists later. Did you know that? Well, what was it? I don't know. But Sputnik, when she went up, was not alone. But the American government and our program suffered a tremendous black eye. Those pesky Reds had beat us into outer space. What was next? The missile gap. Because our missiles were primarily still blowing up on the launch pad when we tried to send them up. And I'm sure some of you folks that were around there, you'll remember that. But we spit between our hands, rubbed them together, and we decided, by golly, we're going to jump into this space race. And around 1958, the Mercury 7 were chosen. These were going to be America's premier first men into outer space. Unfortunately, the Russians beat us again. They sent Yuri Gagarin up. Alan Shepard followed up with a short 15-minute suborbital flight, but we still had a long way to go. Incidentally, this was all under the auspices of President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower was a military man. As a matter of fact, it was Dwight Eisenhower that basically ended up beating the Germans with the Normandy invasion. He was the supreme Allied commander. But when he came out, he got out of the Army, he entered politics, became president, and he acknowledged that there was something wrong there because our missile programs were all under the auspices of the United States Armed Forces. And there had to be a better way. Well, Eisenhower went ahead and created NASA. Now, incidentally, NASA, at the very beginning, were a bunch of guys sitting around a rented table in a rented office trying to figure out, what are we going to do next? Like a lot of high-powered groups, they thought, well, you know, we ought to check out a brain bust and see if they could make some recommendations for us. They ended up going to the Brookings Institute. How many of you folks in here have heard of the Brookings Report that came on? Okay. It just so happens about 1992, when I was the director of research for UFO magazine, I got a call one day from Dick Hoagland, who at the time was working with Professor Stan McDaniel. Now, if you were around during that period of time, and if you were following what was happening in this crazy UFO field, you will remember that there was a tremendous controversy over something called the face on Mars. Now, the face on Mars was something that Hoagland had been chasing for many, many years. As a matter of fact, he wrote several books on that. But one of the matters of controversy dealt with what was then another NASA mission that was going back to Mars called the Mars Observer. This was a probe that cost in the neighborhood of $1 billion, that's with a B, and a half dollars. $1.5 billion, and they weren't going to have a camera on the damn thing. No camera. Now, why would anybody want to go to Mars and not take some pictures? Well, Hoagland couldn't figure that out, neither could Stan McDaniel. So they were lobbying heavily to get NASA to put a camera on that craft. And he called me up and he said, Don, he said, I've got a question for you. He said, we're looking for a document that NASA purportedly had prepared for them back in the early 60s. And he said, I can't find anything out about it. He said, would you do a little investigating on that, see if you could locate it? And I said, well, sure. And I ended up discovering the Brookings Institute document on the peaceful pursuits of outer space that was prepared for NASA back about 1961-62. And I might add, there's some very interesting reading in here. Has anybody in the audience read the Brookings report? Anybody? One gentleman in the back, that's all I see. Over here. Okay. In there, Brookings, when they were preparing this document, now remember, this is 1961. We're talking 60, 61. We're talking way, way back there. We're talking when people like Donald Keyhoe was still running NICAP, fighting with the Air Force on an almost weekly basis, that yes, there are real UFOs. This was even before the Betty Barney Hill incident. And they came to the conclusion in that document, and incidentally, they had some pretty powerful scientific minds in there, people like Margaret Mead, okay? And they came to the conclusion that not if, ladies and gentlemen, not if, but when we discover either alien life or alien artifacts in our solar system, because I don't think they had any idea at that time that we would be able to travel outside of the solar system. But we have to ask ourselves, do we release this information or do we keep it concealed? Because if we release this information, it's going to have an electrifying effect on several types of peoples, okay? Scientists and engineers will be devastated because they will realize basically how primitive they really are. And the other groups of people that will be electrified, devastated, and who knows what, will be fundamentalist religious peoples. And they didn't specify whether they would be Protestant, Roman Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, I mean just highly religious people. So, we have to ask ourselves, what do we do? And incidentally, they gave a date when they expected this to happen, either on or before the date of 1982. Now, here we are in the year 2012. Does anybody have a speculation on what they came up with? But then we get into the good stuff. President John F. Kennedy was elected in 1961. Took office. First thing he did, one of the very first things he did was to challenge the nation. He challenged them to put a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade is out. By God, we did it. But it wasn't without a heavy cost and a heavy price. Chaffee, Grissom, White. Anybody know what those three men are famous for? I'm sorry? They died in the capsule fire. Incidentally, the Russians lost a heck of a lot of cosmonauts too. We don't really know actually how many. But these were our first casualties. But on July the 20th, 1969, if you were around then, chances are you were just doing exactly what I was. You were glued in front of your television set when they touched down. And I'll never forget the feeling that I felt. I was so proud, I thought my heart was going to explode out of my chest. By God, we did it. But before we did it, before we got up there, NASA was not hedging all their bets. They asked for a scientific inquiry on lunar phenomena. You see, ladies and gentlemen, lunar phenomena is actually a very, very old thing. World-class astronomers for over 400 years have been observing anomalous activities on the moon. Lights. After the invention of the telescope, things like lunar domes. Things that they thought at the time were exploding volcanoes. Now we know today that virtually the moon is geologically dead. So what were those astronomers actually seeing? And incidentally, this report is available on the web. NASA Technical Report R277. If you're interested, I highly, highly recommend that you go up, get a copy of it, and take a look at it. It's rather large, but it's fascinating. But they wanted to know exactly what might be waiting for them up there. How many people in here are aware? And boy, I'll tell you, I announced this on my old radio program, UFOs Tonight on CRN, many, many moons ago, no pun intended, that when the first astronauts went to the moon, boy, did I catch a lot of crap. They were carrying weapons. They were armed with .45 caliber handguns in their capsule when they went to the moon. Now, at the time I was told, Ecker, you're out of your mind, you're nuts. No, because we called up, we talked to public relations at NASA, they verified it. The reason they gave, okay, was that when our astronauts were going up or coming back, okay, in the off chance they landed somewhere like a jungle, okay, then they would not be, they would not be at the mercy of the environment or the people or the animals or whatever there. I thought about that. Do you remember where the Apollo astronauts always landed when they came back? In the ocean. Okay, all right, I'm easy. But there were some things up there like the Curtis Cross. Now, this is the reason I brought my laser pointer here. Right there. That photograph was taken in 1956 by an amateur astronomer. Incidentally, this photograph ran in Harvard's Sky and Telescope magazine. No idea what that is. It's a cross. No idea what it is or who put it there. But there it is. And if you know anything about nature, you know that there are no straight lines that I'm aware of in nature. There's two straight lines, one going one way and one going the other. Aha, Apollo 14. Down on the surface of the moon. Hey, incidentally, there's nobody in here that wants to argue that we did not go to the moon, is there? Are you serious or are you putting me on? You're serious. You don't think we went to the moon? I'm sorry? And how do you think they did this? In a studio. How many people in here think they're full of it? That they're full of it. Okay. That's my producer back there. There's Edgar Mitchell. And something very unusual. All the original astronauts, when they went to the moon, were placed in quarantine once they came back. Now, even as scientifically challenged as I am, I know that it would be pretty hard for any type of bacteria, viruses, or whatever else to survive millions of years of bombardment by solar rays. But they were afraid of something being brought back initially. At least this is what they said. You also know about the government regulation that was signed into law at that time. And if you don't, I'm going to tell you about it. That anyone that was exposed to an extraterrestrial source, artifact, whatever, could be basically locked up without due process for an indefinite period of time. Are you aware of that? I know there's got to be some people in here that are aware of that. Well, it's my understanding that that has since been rescinded. But I often wondered about all of those people that have stated that they underwent an involuntary extraterrestrial abduction. If you were one of those people, that would have to have been a very scary concept for you to deal with. And there they are, Edgar Mitchell. I believe the guy in the middle was Rusa and Shepard, after they were released from quarantine. And the very last mission that went back, Apollo 17. And suddenly, the plug is pulled. Now, this is where I began to wonder about some very, very unusual things. We had spent in excess of $20 billion to go to the moon. We lost lives going to the moon. Poured a tremendous amount of national treasure into that program. And if you were around in the 60s, you will recall a lot of what was being promised across the board. When I say promised, I'm talking about in magazine articles, news articles, scientific talking heads on the tube talking about what our plans and projects and programs were. And Hollywood was behind the whole concept. 2001, A Space Odyssey, one of the genuinely gigantic blockbusters. People were really going crazy over outer space. And suddenly, arbitrarily, with no warning, boom, it's over. Which is doubly curious considering that we had already had additional astronauts trained, ready to go, the rockets built. Listen to me, the rockets were built and all they had to do was light them off. And they're currently sitting down in Florida, rusting away, and they're a habitat for wild animals that have built their nest and had who knows how many generations of young animals growing up in these rocket motors. Never one believable reason why that happened. And we withdrew from space until Skylab. In low Earth orbit, we had some feel-good public relations deals with the Russians. They sent some spaceships up there. We ended up docking with each other. But that was it. Until the shuttle. 1982. Going to be our space truck. Once again, simply, basically, low Earth orbit. We had a few, well, maybe more than a few unmanned probes go out into the solar system. But with the exception of the shuttles, that was it. Nobody even looked at the moon anymore. As a matter of fact, astronomers, other than amateurs, if you ask any astronomer, do you ever look at the moon? Oh, no. Why? Why would I do that? Well, it's right there for one thing. Oh, no, there's nothing interesting on the moon. Until you do a little research. The moon, okay, we brought back a rock from the moon that is called the Genesis rock that has been dated at 5 billion years old. 5 billion years old. Which is interesting. But the dirt that the rock was in was an additional billion years older than the rock. Anybody know how old planet Earth is? 4.5 billion years. Our solar system is guesstimated to be at approximately 5 billion years. Begs the question, where did that rock come from? Where did that dirt come from? And we ignored the moon until the early 90s. Excuse me a second. Anybody know what that gadget up there is? That's Clementine. We sent Clementine back to the moon, 94. Wasn't NASA that did it. It was the Department of Defense. DOD sent that spacecraft back with some of the most high-tech cameras and other instruments that you could imagine. When I tell you that if there's anybody in here that still smokes, if you were to take a pack of cigarettes out of your pocket and drop it on the ground, that device could read the label from thousands of miles in outer space. Could read the packet of cigarettes. Now, what did they do when they went back? They rephotographed the moon. Over 2 million photographs were taken. The moon was completely remapped. Okay, I've got a question. Why? Were they looking for something? I was in the military. I did 2 tours, 2 combat tours in Vietnam. I can tell you from my own experience, and we're talking micro, not macro, but micro, that you send a scout in to look at something so the guys upstairs know what's probably there. You go in, you do whatever it is you got to do, you leave, and then they send over the reconnaissance aircraft to see what's changed. Are you following my logic? We were up there in the 60s and early 70s, and then we abandoned it. And suddenly the Department of Defense goes back in 94 and completely and totally remaps and rephotographs the moon. How many of those photographs have anybody seen? So, now we get back to me, always a favorite subject of mine. I talked to Jim Sylvan. Matter of fact, I ended up doing a couple of shows with him. He told me, he said, Don, he said, you've got to get that book, you've got to read it. Okay. Well, I tracked it down. As a matter of fact, that's a scan of the cover. You can see how well used it's been. To say that I was slightly amazed would also be an understatement. Has anybody in here read this book? Once again, the gentleman in the back. Is that it? Maybe 1 or 2 others. Okay. Leonard was a science writer. And just as Apollo 17 was winding down, the very last shot to the moon, one of his buddies, and he had some buddies in NASA, said, George, you ought to come over here, boy. You ought to see some of these Apollo photographs. They'll blow your mind. And, you know, like everybody else, he's thinking, oh, rocks and, you know, okay. Why would rocks or craters blow my mind? No, he said, you've got to come over. You've got to take a look at some of this stuff. So Leonard did. He started going through some of these photographs. And incidentally, the photographs that he stated in this book with the accompanying numbers, I later got practically a complete set of the same photographs. Now, one thing about many NASA photographs, if you get them today, can I be very blunt? The resolution is for shit. Because It's as if they go out of their way to make these things as unappealing as possible. I've seen some sharp photographs, and before tonight's over, you're going to see one too. There were other books written about our mysterious spaceship moon. Some better, some worse. But there were beginning to be a lot of people that were asking some very uncomfortable questions about our lunar friend up there. And then this guy came along, Ingo Swann. Is that name familiar to anybody in here? Ingo Swann is the man that put together the protocols for the remote viewing program that was carried on by the Department of Defense, the DIA, the CIA, and Stanford Research for many years. I know the man. He is an extraordinarily gifted man in that field, and I'm talking about psychic phenomena. Matter of fact, my wife and I had dinner with Swann several years ago when he was out here in California. He resides in New York, but he's got family here. Occasionally he comes out. We were over in Burbank at a little Italian restaurant over there. Spent about 4.5, probably 5 hours over dinner and talking about my lunar research and specifically an incident that happened to Swann. Is anybody in here familiar with that incident, his remote viewing project for a secret covert intelligence agency and what he saw? Is there anybody in here familiar with that? Several in the back? Yes. The dark side of the moon, which is a figure of speech. It's not really any darker than any other part of the moon, but the part of the moon that we never see from down here on Earth. What he remotely viewed, and oh, there is Ingo, myself. What he remotely viewed appeared to be, the only way to say it, is what he took to be an extraterrestrial facility on the far side of the moon. There's some other things in that book, if you can find a copy, Penetration, and if you, obviously, you must have an interest in this esoteric material. If you can find a copy, my God, get it and read it. So, UFOs Tonight, CRN. There I am, weekly, banging out shows. And I got to tell you, the ones that I did with people on the topic of lunar phenomena were mind blowers. Some of these are still incidentally available online. My current radio program, called Dark Matters Radio, carried by Cyberstation USA out of Boston. But around November of 1995, I interviewed a man by the name of Vito Sicari, a petrochemical engineer. Is that name familiar to you folks? Vito Sicari, have you ever heard of him? Well, Sicari in 1979 was working for an outfit in Houston, and they had a client who was a Venezuelan oil company that had dispatched a couple of engineers up to Houston on whatever it was they were working on. Now, this guy that was sent up was an American, As a matter of fact, Sakari had met him through, I guess it was teletype machines. This was before the internet, before Skype, before, web cameras or anything like that. But this guy came up. Sakari was detailed to shepherd him around for the next couple of weeks while they were doing whatever it was they were doing with the oil thing, and to basically be this guy's buddy. So he gets up there, he pulls a copy of George Leonard's book out of his pocket. He handed it to Sakari. He said, look, he said, what I really want to do up here is to go over to NASA and see some moon pictures. He said, but before we do any of that, he said, I want you to take this book home tonight and read it, or as much of it as you can, and then I'll talk to you tomorrow. So Sakari took it home, read a chunk of it, came in the next day, wasn't sure what the hell to think. And this guy said, I want to see if this stuff is really there. So they naively assumed, we'll go over to NASA. Hey, this was a taxpayer-funded thing. Well, guys, the taxpayers are here. We want to see our moon pictures. And they thought it would be that easy. Wrong. What NASA put those guys through was one of the most amazing stories you've ever heard in your life. But they ended up upsetting Sakari and this other guy, and I mean upsetting them badly. And if you have a computer, you got a sound card, the shows are free, I recommend you go up to the Dark Matters Radio website, or the download page, get that particular show, Vito Sakari, and listen to it. It's 2 hours. It's a combination of laughing your tail end off and being so damned mad you want to scream. But I've got a couple of clips here, audio clips that I want to show. And if we could play Vito 1, please. Now this is Vito Sakari on UFOs Tonight.
Because, hell, there were only 40 pictures. And we scratched our head because, hell, there were only 40 pictures in the book, you know what I mean?
Right.
3 days seems like a long time, but they had some rules. He said, you got to understand, we have certain procedures, and it's up to you. You can decide yes or no. We'll let you come down, we'll let you look at this stuff, but here are the rules. No recording equipment, no cameras, no pencils, no pens, no papers, no pads, no notebooks, no calculators, nothing. The only thing we would be permitted to go in with is a small magnifying glass, like a jeweler's loupe.
Right.
And we were allowed to bring the book because that was our property anyway, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We asked about the book. And that was it. When we went back the following day, we were pretty excited. We got back into the room, having gone through the tunnel, and when we got there, one of the walls off to our left was open. It turns out to be a false panel. And behind that panel is another room. And in that room they had five almost full-length conference room tables. And they were shaped in a U pattern, 2 going up, 1 across the back, and then 2 coming down, okay? And laid out in all of along that U-shaped configuration were all of the photographs that we had requested, and apparently a hell of a lot more. Because as it turns out, some of the photos that Leonard had in his book were actually what they call the base photos. The computer had picked up so many anomalies that it triggered a sequence of additional photos in sort of a zoom sequence. And apparently when he went to pick those...
No, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that from the lunar orbiter spacecraft, it was tracking the moon, and the onboard computer would trigger a camera when it saw something it was interested in.
Yeah, see, they weren't sure they were going to get the unmanned craft back. They didn't know if it would ever, in case of an accident, if it burns up in the atmosphere, that type of thing. You remember these things had to land in the ocean.
Right.
With parachutes and all that stuff. So what they were doing is they were taking the photos and they were developing them on board. And then they were transmitting them back to Earth before the spacecraft ever came back.
Right.
This way they would at least have the pictures, even if they lose the capsule.
So if
Well, as the computer that was analyzing these photos would scan them, every time it would pick up an anomaly, that triggered another sequence of photos.
okay.
And sometimes, and that sequence became a zoom sequence. It got closer and closer and closer and closer.
Well, I wanted to make sure that that was clear for the.
So, after 3 weeks of having these two guys jump through every hoop imaginable, NASA finally says, okay, you can come down, you can see these photos. Now, Leonard had specified about 40 photos. That's all he was aware of. But as Sakari stated, they also had a series of zooms on some of the photographs that were some of the most amazing things. Now, if you could play Vito 2. Now, listen very carefully to what he has to say.
Minute or two, I got to tell you, it turned into a very quiet and a very solemn type occasion for us.
Why is that?
We knew what we were looking at, and we knew what it meant. And this wasn't a game anymore.
Okay, what were you looking at?
We were looking at, as best as I can remember from all of it now, the great majority of the stuff we saw looked like excavation type or construction equipment. Coming from the petrochemical industry, we were pretty familiar with building refineries and that type of stuff. We know construction equipment. We were coordinating this with Leonard's book. There were pipelines. There were pipe fittings. There were certain pictures had what appeared to be some type of construction equipment. I can't say it's comparable to a bulldozer or anything like that, but it was earth-moving or moon-moving type equipment.
Now, Leonard, in his book, when he made statements about what he saw in the photographs, which apparently was artificial constructions with a definite intelligence behind it,
No question about it.
that they were huge.
Yeah, these things are extremely huge.
Now, we're not talking about a 30-foot bulldozer, are we?
No. So, in fact, that was one of the frustrating parts to us. On the back of each photo was the statistical data that you would need to calculate anything on the surface. For example, the back of the photo told you how high off the surface this picture was taken.
Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Now, here are some of the photos where you can see what I feel are definitely artificial constructions. For example, right here, have you heard about the famous bridge on the moon? On the Mare Crisium crater? Well, there it is. Here, you will see what looks like some very old, constructions that were either damaged or destroyed. But you can see that right here. And my favorite, and I'll show this in a little higher detail in a minute, right here. See the arrow pointing to it. This is what I call the castle wall. The bridge these destroyed works here. And the castle. I call it the castle. What you see here, if you can get up here, the top curves around. You'll see an extension with what appears to be some kind of ball on the very end of it here, casting a shadow down across the base of the structure. Now, I've got an interesting story about that. Remember the guy I mentioned, Jim Sylvan? Sometime back, I guess it was in the 80s, I think it was in Florida, but Alan Shepard was having a book signing, and Sylvan, who used to have a lot of these photographs, had this photograph mounted. And he went down to the book signing. And he waited till almost the end when Shepard was signing these books. He walked up to him and he said, "Sir," he said, "big fan of yours. I've admired your work for, God, many years, going all the way back to the Apollo program. I've got this photograph of Mayor Crisium." He said, "Admiral, would you please sign this?" So Shepard took the picture, signed it. Before he could hand it back, Sylvan said, "Sir, by the way, can you tell me what that is?" And he pointed to this castle-looking structure. He told me, he said, "Don," he said, "Shepard looked down at that thing. He kind of blanched. He handed me the picture back, didn't say a word, and he walked off." Okay. Now, some of the other rather amazing photographs that Leonard originally himself discovered. The rolling what's-this, leaving a track, a tread behind. Now, back in 2001, I was a guest on Art Bell's Coast to Coast, talking about lunar phenomena. And if anybody in here used to listen to Art, especially back in the 90s, you know that Art had, let me be charitable and polite, at best, some very dicey customers occasionally on Coast to Coast. Now, I've always had a fairly, well, I'll just be honest, a kind of a hard-assed reputation when it came to UFO material. I guess it comes from when I was a cop. But if there's something that I think is really there, I'll go to the wall with it. When I sent a bunch of these photographs to Art, I expected Art would look at them and say, "You know, Ecker, I think, yeah, you might have something there." Well, to make a long story short, he ended up doing the third-degree routine on me. And I'm going to play something for you here really quickly. But this is one photograph that when Bell saw it, blew his socks off. And he said, "Well, what am I looking at?" And I said, "Well, you're looking at what appears to be an artificial whatever crawling across the lunar surface. Actually, there are two of them. Here's the other one. But this one you really can see, leaving a very pronounced, almost tank-like tread in the lunar dirt." He said, "Well, what's NASA say about it?" And I said, "Well, right there, Art," and I pointed this out, "is the crater that this thing crawled up and out of. He said, wait a minute, it came up and out of the crater. I said, yeah, look at the track. Right there it is. He said, well, what does NASA say it was? I said, well, they said it was a rock. A rock? Well, how did it get out of the crater? I said, I don't know, ask NASA. Right there it was. Now, if that doesn't look artificial, but then we have some other craters with some very unusual artifacts around the crater. Now, I didn't, you know, when I set this up to come in here, I didn't know how the audience was situated. I'm sure some of these are really hard to see. But like right here, right off the edge of the crater, is what appears to be a pad of some type with 4 little indentures in it right here. I mean, if you guys want to come up after the show is over, I'll be happy to go through these again with some of these interesting photographs. But this is another thing that has a high stench of artificiality. And once more, another crater with workings on the crater wall. Looked like these were machine cut out of there. Try Snecker. Now, what the hell that is, I have no idea. But it looks like a tower to me. Sure doesn't look like it's an artifact from an impact. And we get to one of the most interesting areas on the moon. King's Crater. Now, I blew up a couple of the most interesting parts of this. Right here and right here. But we'll get to that in a second. This area screams artificiality. Now, I'd like to play Art Bell 1, please. And this is a very short clip from that program.
Down, I think it's third from the bottom.
Third from the bottom, right? 1, 2, 3. Oh. All right, I'm there. It says 2 rolling objects.
Right.
In Vitello crater, is it?
Yes.
These objects rolled up and out of the crater. Notice
Right.
the track, the larger one. Up and out of the crater?
Yeah. Now, NASA says that you're not looking at anything unusual. These are just rocks that are rolling across the lunar surface because of some inexplicable geological event.
What?
But the problem is that they rolled up and out of the crater.
Well, wait a minute. Some, they're saying nothing special, just some anomalous effect on the moon. What, a moonquake or something? Is that what they're talking about?
Well, it would seem that that's what they're referring to.
Okay, let's go to clip 2, please.
There's an area on the moon called King's Crater.
All right, now I'm looking. You've got an arrow and you've got a circle.
Right. On King's Crater.
Yes, what am I looking at?
Okay. If you look just beside the circle to the left, and at about the 10 o'clock position.
Yes, I see an arrow, yes.
There is, and you have to look at it. I realize that if your eye is not trained, it's going to be hard to see it first.
Looks like a rock.
Well, it's not. If you look at it closer and click on it to get the full effect, Art,
all right.
You're going to see what, to me, beyond any doubt, looks like the rear end of a satellite dish.
Wait a minute here.
Right there.
Oh, it does. It does. Are you sure, Don, that we're just not... It does actually look like the rear end of a satellite dish.
Okay, this is King's Crater. Now, the place that I was just talking about was right here. Right here is this artifact. Now, obviously, for you folks in the back, you can't see any of this. But there's two areas. Wait a minute, what did I just do? Okay. There's this right here and this. Let's go here first. You will see by the crater wall right here what appears to be a building with two lit windows right there. It always struck me as looking like an old Army Quonset hut. Now that obviously is not what it is, but right there. You folks in the front row, can you see it? Can you see what I'm talking about? Or are you too far back? And right here, what I was talking to Bill about, which seriously resembles the rear of a satellite dish. Now, so what are we talking about? Is it possible that if any of this is not moon dust and crap, that there is something up there? Well, even with those photographs, and I've spent literally years on the ones that you've already seen and a number of other ones, when I discovered this photograph. I had a very good friend who was a ham radio operator, Bill Nelson. And after we met, we became good friends. Bill had just retired, was running for had been running the IT department for one of the major banks downtown. And Bill had some buddies over at JPL that were ham radio operators. And he had gone to one of these guys, and he said, man, he said, you know, I've gotten recently an interest in lunar photographs. He said, I know you guys have got to have some over there. He said, would it be possible to see any of these? And the guy said, sure. So he brought Bill over a stack. Bill called me up. We spent an afternoon scanning them. Then we started to go through them. And then I discovered this. Now, what is that? Well, it appears to be a pipe running through the wall of this crater. You can track it all the way up to here, where it's coming out the rim of this wall with a very odd attachment on the end of the pipe. Here it is in higher detail. And you can see where it runs through the soil here to right there. Now, if in fact that is artificial, my God, how did it get there? How long has it been there? That's absolutely, the first time I saw this, I was just absolutely flabbergasted. Now, incidentally, later on I did find some other photographs taken from different angles that still clearly shows something running through that crater wall. So, we get to the bottom of the slideshow presentation. Is somebody else on the moon? Well, in my humble opinion, if they're not there now, they in fact were there in the past. And we're in here at any rate for one reason, because the majority of you folks that are in here have an interest in unidentified flying objects or aspects of that. The bottom line is simple. If even one case of unidentified flying objects is real, and when I talk about real, I'm talking about technology from someone else's civilization, from somewhere else, then the chances are probably 98% that at least some of those represent extraterrestrial technology, another star system. Does it make sense that every time one of those things show up, and ladies and gentlemen, a hell of a lot of them seem to be showing up, that they're going home and coming back? No. If any of this is real, it only would make sense that they would have facilities set up, like on the moon, perhaps Mars, perhaps at various locations around our planet under the sea, and that they're going there, kind of like an R&R spot. So, basically, that is it.
Okay, I guess we'll wrap it up. Don, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your great presentation.